Okay, hello everyone, welcome back. And today we're going to be learning chapter 6 of Shemuel Bet, which happens to be this week's Haftarah. And the common theme of the Parashah and the Haftarah is the tragic death when involved in connecting to the service. And when it came to the dedicating the Mishkan on the 8th day, we had the tragic deaths of Nadab and Avihu, and bringing the Aron to Yerushalyaim, we have the tragic death of Uzzah. We're going to try and understand this and what was going on exactly here. So let's begin with our source sheet, which I'm bringing onto the screen here. And it says something very interesting here. The very first pasuk, it says, "Vayosef od David ekol bachur b'Yisrael shloshim aleph." And again, David, and it skips out the word gathered, but we're going to imply it there. Again, David amassed all the men of Israel, 30,000. Kol Bachor B'Yisrael, all the young men of Israel. Now, go to the commentary on this. A number of different positions. Rashi says they gathered to him when they coronated him in Hebron, that's King David, and now they gathered again to escort the Aron to Jerusalem. The Abravanel says an additional 30,000 men. So it's not just 30,000, it's 30,000 plus what they already had to protect the Aron from potential attack from the Pelishtim. And then the Malbim, quoting the Talmud Yerushalmi, says that each town sent a Beit Din of 3. So there were 90,000 elders to escort the Aron. So it wasn't. So two things here. Number one, it wasn't just 30,000. It was 30,000 times 3. And they were elders to escort the Aron. The Ma'am Loez says, following this train of thought of the Malbim, they weren't soldiers, but Torah scholars. According to some, David appointed 30,000 new rabbis. And according to others, he appointed 90,000 new rabbis in honor of this happy occasion. So here, when we're reading this pasuk, which just seems to be 30,000 soldiers brought the Aron to Yerushalayim, it's actually could be 90,000. It might not even be soldiers. It could be 90,000 Talmidei Hachamim. And talking about the spiritual caliber of the Jewish people at this time, that David wanted to have Torah scholars there. And it says, pasuk bet, Vayakom vayelech David v'chol ha'am asher ito, and David arose and went with all the people that were with him, mi ba'alei Yehuda, from ba'alei Yehuda, la'alot misham, to go up from there, et Aron ha'Elohim, the Aron of God, asher nikra Shem Hashem Tzavakot, Yoshev HaKeruvim alav, which is called the name of Hashem, Lord of hosts, who dwells upon the Keruvim, upon the cherubs. Now, I want to be a couple of things to make note here is this phrase here, Aron HaElokim, which means the Ark of God. We're going to see that later on, after being called Aron HaElokim many times, it's then changed to Aron Hashem, Aron of Yud Kei Vav Kei. And I haven't really come up with a thorough thesis on this, but I believe that there is a significance to why it's going from Aron HaElokim to Aron Hashem. And perhaps it's suggesting that there is going from strict justice to an area of divine mercy, but we'll see perhaps when we go through the Psukim. And it says here in Pasuk Gimel, Vayakivu et Aron HaElohim el agala chadasha. Now, this Pasuk should be setting off warning lights in our heads. It should be, wait, stop, what are you doing? And this is not the way to carry the Aron. As it says, they set the Aron of God upon a new wagon or cart, vayisa'uhu, and they carried it, mibeit Avinadav, from the house of Avinadav, asher b'giv'ah. That's where it's been since the beginning of Shemuel Aleph, when the Philistines returned it, also on a cart. Ve'uza ve'achio b'nei Avinadav nohagim et agala chadasha. And we have these two brothers, the sons of Avinadav, Uza and Achio, and their job was to make sure the agala was going in the right place. Okay. Dalet. Vayisa'uhu mibeit Avinadav asher b'giv'ah, and they brought it out of the house of Avinadav, im Aron Elokim, that was on the hill, which with the Aron of God, v'achio holech lifnei ha'aron, and Achio is walking before the ark. Okay. V'David v'chol beit Yisrael mesachakim lifnei Hashem. And David and the whole house of Israel are being mesachek, which means playing, joking, happy, joyful. We're going to see, I've put this in blue and in bold because it's a very interesting word, because it can also not mean good things. And they were doing something. They were happy, they were joyful, but perhaps not totally respectful. And they had all manner of instruments, not necessarily the instruments that we normally use by the Levi'im. And they had all types of instruments, cypress wood with harps, psalteries, timbrels, and all these other things, which I'm not sure what they are. Cholatse, veroshim, kinarot, nevalim, tupim, uveminananeim, and seltzelim. Okay, not sure about all of them. A lot of, had a full orchestra. Vayavo ad Goren Nachon, and they came to Goren Nachon, and here's the important pasuk. Vayishlach Uza el Aron Elohim, and Uza put forth his hand to the ark of God, Vayochezbo, and he grasped hold of it. Why? Kishametu habakar, because the oxen had swayed it. He was worried that the ark was going to fall, so he put his hand forth to protect the Aron. Zayin, Vayicha af Hashem be'Uza, and Hashem was angry with Uza. Vayakehu sham ha'elokim, and God struck him there, al hashal, on the spot. Vayamot sham, and he died there, im Aron ha'elokim. Okay, and he died there with the ark of God. And it says next, pasuk chet, vayicha le David, and David was angered, al asher paratz Hashem, peretz be'Uza, vayikra lemakom hahu, peretz Uza ad hayom hazeh. David was angered because Hashem had made a breach upon Uza, and he called that place Peretz Uza until this very day. Vayira David et Adonai bayom hahu, and David was scared on that day of God. Vayom, and he said, Ech yavo elai Aron Hashem, how can I bring up the ark to, how can I do it? And there are many, many questions we have on these passages, which we're going to try and deal with today, such as, what was David thinking using a wagon? Rob's question, which he put in the chat there, is this the same wagon which was used by the Philistines, by the Philistines? What did Uzzah do wrong? Why is Hashem angry with him? Is David angry? Who's David angry with? So lots of things to have a look here in the Perushim. So let's have a look at the commentaries on all of this. Okay. Rashi says, David erred in a matter that even school children know. Okay, as we know, it's a pasuk in Parashat Naso. Because the service of the holy things belonged unto them, they shall bear them upon their shoulders. Okay, this is something which is carried on the shoulders of the Leviim. What was David thinking? But since David remarked, your statutes have been like songs unto me in the house of my sojournings, he was punished for exhibiting undue confidence in his knowledge of Torah. By way of coming to this, and Uzzah died because of him. Therefore, when they brought the Aron from the house of Oved Edom later on in the parak, they brought it upon their shoulders. They realized their mistake. So Rashi is saying, why did Uzzah die? Because David made a mistake. What was David? How could David make a mistake? David had made a mistake on something so basic because he'd become arrogant in his Torah knowledge. Torah is like music to my heart. Don't be so full of yourself, David. I'm going to make you make a mistake on something very basic to make you humble again. But wait, that's why Uzzah died? That's not fair for Uzzah. You know, punish David. Why punish Uzzah? The Ma'am Lo'ez says, a combination of feeling he knew all of the Torah and not showing the proper reverence to the Torah by referring it to all of it as songs, as such, God made him stumble on something even school children know. Okay, so Ma'am Lo'ez just paraphrasing Rashi there. So Ma'am Lo'ez goes a little bit further. How could David have made such a basic mistake? Number one, David assumed the requirement to carry the Aron on one's shoulders only applied when it was being transported from its regular place and not when it was being brought from somewhere else. Number two, at the time, the Aron only housed the fragments of the first luchot. David assumed it was permitted to transport it on a new wagon. Number three, David thought he was further sanctifying God's name by using the same new wagon that the Pelishtim had used when they returned the Aron to the Jewish people. So the Ma'am Lo'ez is there coming to answer Rob's question, that it was the very same one which was in Shmuel Aleph, the cart pulled by the singing cows that we remember from a few months ago. So if we've addressed perhaps how David could have made a mistake, what was Uzzah's sin that he deserved to die? And Rashi says it's as follows. He made a mistake. His mistake, the mistake there of Uzzah was, he should have made a kal v'chomer and a fortiori. If it lifted its bearers over the Jordan, certain it was able to lift itself. The Aron is not carried by the Leviim. The Leviim are carried by the Aron, and that was shown by the great miracle that we saw right a few years ago at the beginning when we read the book of Yehoshua, when one of the miracles listed is the Aron carried itself over the Jordan River, along with those carrying it. The Ma'am Lo'ez lists 6 transgressions committed in transporting the Aron. Number one, they mounted it on a new wagon instead of carrying it on their shoulders, that we've explained. Number two, David deprived the Leviim of the opportunity to serve God in the manner they were chosen for. Number three, Uzzah and Achio should not have directed the animals. They should have allowed the animals free rein in a similar way to how the Pelishtim let the animals, the oxen, make it on their own. Number four, they should have put the Aron's poles in position. Instead, they touched the Aron with their bare hands. Number five, Achio walked in front of the Aron, showing his back. Number six, although it was right for the people to rejoice, they did not show enough reverence or awe. They also did not use the correct musical instruments of the Leviim. So we're going through here and reading these psukim. Every detail that's mentioned in these psukim is there to tell us something wrong. Number one, placing it on an agala chadasha, a new wagon. Number two, having Achio and Uzzah steadying the wagon. Number three, having Achio walk in front of the Aron. Number four, they were mesachek. And number five, the fact that Uzzah touched the Aron with his bare hands. And number six, he didn't realize the Aron doesn't need your help. The Aron's going to help you. So we see all these things coming out. These aren't mere details. They're there to tell us they're doing different things. And seven here, the musical instruments, they weren't the musical instruments which are normally used. Okay? So a lot going on here through these psukim. Now, it says here that David was angered. It says, Vayichar le David. Now, on this, the Ma'am Loez quotes the Gemara in Sotah that when we normally say that someone is angry, it's Vayichar af. But here it just says Vayichar. And he says, our sages point out, Vayichar af means burning anger, which is not the case here. And he goes on to say, it is unthinkable that David could have been angry with the heavenly judgment. Rather, David was anguished by what had transpired, and he may also have been angry at himself. Why? Because he held himself responsible for Uzzah's death. Okay, so here, don't think, heaven forbid, that David was angry with God. Rather, his response to the tragedy was anguish, despair, and perhaps that he himself was upset with himself, that he could have made such a terrible mistake, and their whole conduct, that they didn't make the proper arrangements. Very similar, if you think, to the Torah portion where the deaths of Nadav and Avihu. There are many reasons given for why Nadav and Avihu were killed, but when Moshe tries to comfort Aron, we see that Aron says, Vayidom Aharon, Aron was silent. Sometimes the biggest and the best response to tragedy is silence. Silent thought, because we don't understand, we don't know. Today being Yom HaShoah, we don't understand tragedy, we don't understand all these difficulties, and rather than trying to explain them, we're silent. Perhaps David was silent and in quiet contemplation at the death of Uzzah. It says here in the next pasuk that David feared Hashem that day. How can the Aron come to me? I can't do anything. And what was he fearful of? He thought to himself, how can I bring the Aron? I'm not worthy of bringing the Aron. Remember, who were Uzzah and Achio? Uzzah and Achio were from the house of Avinadav. That's where the Aron had been for all this time. And so therefore, the Aron was very much part of them. They knew how to look after the Aron. So he's saying to himself, if these righteous Leviim, Uzzah and Achio, if Uzzah died, how can I'm too fearful of doing it. On another level, we understand that David is the one of Ivdu et Hashem besimcha, of serving Hashem with joy. Perhaps now David is coming to a different learning of Ivdu et Hashem beyira. We also need to serve God out of fear. And David was learning this day that we serve God when we're happy, and we serve God when we are fearful as well, and that both are required.
There's a unintended consequence also here. You know, in addition to this poor guy getting killed, David now sees the ark as a liability, and he's afraid of it. And if he can't do it, and if the sons and the sons who are supposed to be taking care of it can't even move it, all the more so that people become afraid of this object, and they become afraid to approach it, and they associate it with death and destruction.
Exactly, Rob. I mean, we see this also with in Shemini with Ketoret, and we see it as well in Parashat Korach, that there is a concern that the Ketoret is a sign of death and destruction. The same way here, the Aron is a sign of death and destruction. And so therefore, there has to be a tikkun, which we're going to see in the coming psukim, that we cannot associate Ketoret or the Aron with death. What we have to show with it is reverence. And when the proper reverence is shown, then it's all the better. Rob, what are we going to add?
And in modern times, too, we keep the Torah scrolls. It's not the same thing, but it's symbolically the Torah scrolls are kept in the sanctuary inside of what we call an ark, right? And access to it is very limited. Only certain people are allowed to touch them or read them on certain days, and even still with great reverence. It's nothing has changed since this incident.
Exactly right. I mean, we have in our synagogue, we have what's known as a fascia, which allows you to touch the Sefer Torah scroll. But in Ashkenazic congregations, they don't use a fascia. You cannot touch the cloth. You cannot touch the parchment. You can only touch the Atzei Chaim, the wooden poles. But by Sephardic community, we have a fascia, so you're able to touch the parchment because it's a cloth around the parchment to allow it to be touched that way. And generally, that's the Sephardic tradition. Whereas the Ashkenazic, you're only allowed to touch the Torah by holding the Atzei Chaim, the wooden poles, or holding it with the mantle on top of it, with the me'il, with the cover on top. So here we have 3 psukim, Yud to Yud Bet, which deal with, again, the unintended consequences that where the Aron, where Uzzah was killed and where the Aron was resting, it was at Oved Edom. And where he was, his house and his family were blessed. It says here in Yud, V'lo avad David la'asir elav et Aron Hashem al ir David, v'yateu David beit Oved Edom hagiti. And David did not want to remove unto him the Aron Hashem into the city of David. And David took it aside to the house of Oved Edom the Gittite. And it says, Vayeshev Aron Hashem beit Oved Edom hagiti, shlosha chodashim. Vayvarech Hashem et Oved Edom et kol beito. And I said, now that it's being called the Aron Hashem, the Ark of Mercy, now this ark is being, it says the Aron Hashem dwelled in the house of Edom, the Gittite, 3 months, and Hashem blessed Oved Edom and all of his household. Okay, so we're seeing that now that it's not the Aron of strict judgment, but it's the Aron of mercy, it's now giving blessings out. And it says here in Yud Bet, Vayugad lemelech David lemor, berach Adonai et beit Oved Edom, vet kol asher lo ba'avo Aron ha'Elohim, vayelech David vayal et Aron ha'Elohim mi beit Oved Edom, ir David besimcha. And it was told to King David, saying, Hashem has blessed the house of Oved Edom and all that belongs to him. Because, and now it goes back and returns to, instead of being Aron Hashem, it's now again the Aron HaElokim. And David went and brought the Aron HaElohim from the house of Oved Edom into the city of David with joy. And now we have this new phrase. Instead of what we had before of Mesachek, we now have besimcha. Okay? So looking at our commentaries on this, Oved Edom, who was Oved Edom, says Rashi, he was a Levi. He was one of the gatekeepers. And then there's the Bamidbar Rabbah, which says he was called Oved because he served God properly. He was a proper Eved Hashem. He was an Oved. He was called Edom, which means red, because he made David's face red with embarrassment. Whereas David feared taking the Aron into his possession, Oved welcomed the Aron and he was blessed by God. And why is he called Giti? Because he was from Gat. Rashi to Shemuel Bet. How were they blessed? His wife and his 8 daughters-in-law gave birth to sextuplets. Now, in case you think this is a midrash, the Navi itself in Divrei Hayamim gives the list of the children of Oved Edom. He has 62 children. So either they each gave birth to, you might want to say it's a slight stretch, which is instead of saying they each had 6 children, we're going to say that they had sextuplets in one go. But it's saying that the way that the family was blessed was that they had a very, very large family. And the Mamloi said not only did they have lots of children, but none of them died. Now, this phrase, Mesachakim versus Besimcha, says the Abar Benel, Mischakim, sorry for the typo there, is external expression of joy, whereas Simcha is internal and rooted in the soul. But if I want to really go back and tell you, Mesachek, someone who's Mesachek is someone who's joking. We go back to Torah, it was Yishmael who was Mesachek. Okay, we don't believe in Mesachek. Mesachek can imply improper laughter, making fun of, not showing the proper kavod. So Simcha, on the other hand, is internal joy. It's pure joy. It's joy lishma. Okay, so there's a big difference here. The Torah is saying the Navi is telling us there was a problem here. Where we're mesachek, there was an issue. We had to be besimcha. Okay, and not only that, they needed to carry the Aron on their shoulders. And it says here in Yud Gimel, Vahi ki tza'adu, and it was when the bearers of the Aron, the Nosei Aron Hashem, they realized now they had to carry the Aron. Every time they took 6 steps, Shishat Tza'adim, Vayizbach Shor Umri, they would offer a sacrifice, an ox and a Mari, a fatling. Okay? The David mecharker, and David danced b'chol oz with all his strength lefnei Hashem. The David chagur ephod bad, and David was girded with a linen ephod. The David b'chol beit Yisrael ma'alim et Aron Hashem, and David and the whole house of Israel went up with the Aron Hashem bitrua, with the sound of the shofar, of a kol shofar. Okay. They've changed the instruments. The music has changed now. Now it's kol shofar. V'haya Aron Hashem ba'ir David. And Aron Hashem came to the city of David. U'michal bat Shaul nishkafa ba'ad chalon. And Michal bat Shaul, she peered through the window. V'tere et hamelech David mefazez u'mecharker. And she saw David hopping and dancing before Hashem. Vativez lo beliba. And she loathed him in her heart. We're going to come back to this, that she was unhappy. She was beneath her that David was behaving in such a way. And let's read the rest of the psukim here. Vayaviu et Aron Hashem, vayatzigu oto bimkomo, betoch ha'ohel asher natan lo David, vayal David olot lifnei Hashem mushlamim. And they brought the Aron, and they set it in its place, inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings before Hashem and peace offerings. And why is it a tent? Because yet David hasn't yet built the Beit HaMikdash. He's not going to be able to build the Beit HaMikdash yet. That's obviously going to be Shlomo. It's a temporary dwelling for it until it's time. Vaychal David me'alot ha'olah v'ashlamim vayvarach et ha'am b'shem Hashem tzebakot. And David finished offering the burnt offerings and more peace offerings, and he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts. ויחלק לכל העם לכל המון ישראל למאיש ועד אישה, לאיש חלת לחם אחת, ואשפה אחד, ועשישה אחת, וילך כל העם איש לביתו. And he distributed to the whole people, to the whole multitude of Israel, both to men and women, to each individual, a loaf of bread and a portion of meat and a barrel of wine. And all the people departed, everyone to his home. And everyone was happy with their bread, their meat, and their wine. Vayashov David levarech et beito. And David returned to bless his household. Vatetze Michal bat Shaul likrat David. And Michal, the daughter of Shaul, went out to greet David. And she said, Ma nichbad hayom melech Yisrael asher nigla hayom le'enei amhot avadav ki higalot niglot achad harekim. How honored was today the king of Israel, who exposed himself today in the eyes of the handmaids of his servants, as would expose himself to one of the idlers. Obviously, you can say she's being very sarcastic. How honored was that today the king of Israel? Not at all. You expose yourself in front of the handmaids and the servants and the empty ones of Israel. What are you doing? Vayomer David al Michal lifnei Hashem, asher bachar bi me'avich u'mikol beito letzavot oti nagid alam Hashem al Yisrael. And David said to Michal, before God, who chose me above your father, and above all his house to appoint me prince over the people of Hashem, over Israel, therefore I have made myself merry before the Lord. Interesting, he goes back to using the word mesachek here, rather than besimcha. Unkaloti od mizot mahayiti shafal be'enai imam mahot asher amart imam ikaveda. And if I be demeaned more than this and be abashed in my own eyes, yet of the maidservants of which you have spoken, with them will I get my honor. I don't care if I look a fool in front of people, because I did it all for the glory of Hashem. And then the last pasuk of the chapter, Ulemichal bat Shaul lo haya la yaled ad yom motah. And Michal, the daughter of Shaul, had no child until the day of her death. I'm trying to understand here, what is it the crux? What is the problem here between Michal and David? But before that, the Radak on the offering of the sacrifices every 6 steps, the Leviim expressed their gratitude to God for sparing them from the misfortune that befell Uzzah. They recognized that they felt no burden from the weight of the Aron. As the Aron carried those who were assigned to carry it, they realized, this isn't heavy. Why isn't the Aron heavy? Because it's being carried by Hashem. Or even, the Aron is carrying us. Now we have here Michal despising David in her heart. The Ralbag says, she despised David because he didn't behave like royalty. She thought it wrong that he made such an exhibition of himself, dancing wildly with only a linen ephod as clothing. And the Ralbag says on Pasuk Kaf, David replied that he was showing proper kavod to Hashem. It's more important to show honor to God than worry about how one looks to the masses. You think that your father was a great king? You think he was royal? Look what happened to him. Didn't end up well for him. I'm going to show all my kavod to Hashem. And you don't like it? Too bad. And it says here that Michal was cursed, that she had no more children until the day of her death. Says Rashi, she had no more children, but she did have a child beforehand. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago, that she was known as Eglah, the calf of David, and the Eglah had a child. So I said she had no more children, according to Rashi. Whereas Radak says she had no child to the day of her death, meaning that she is one of the 3 women who died in childbirth in Tanakh. As we know, Rachel Imenu, Rachel, our matriarch, she died in childbirth, giving birth to Binyamin. Eli's daughter-in-law at the beginning of Shemuel Aleph, she died in childbirth. And now here, Michal bat Shaul, Michal, the daughter of Saul, she also died in childbirth. Okay, so here we have the story, and I think the message of this story is there are a few messages to take away from this. One is showing the proper reverence when moving and dealing with holy items. The second one is how we react to tragedy. And the third one is the importance of external appearances versus how we are in front of God. David's only concern is to show proper kavod to Hashem. All other concerns are secondary. Are there any questions on the chapter?
It's interesting how it's another example of the wrong piece of clothing getting somebody into trouble. We think of the coat that Jacob gave to Joseph that got him into quite a bit of trouble. And now, and there are other examples of people wearing the wrong thing at the wrong time. If David had been wearing something else, maybe if he had been wearing, more royal clothing, and instead of just the apron.
Just a very basic effort. I think very, very right. But again, to David, what's he doing? I want to try and do a tikkun. I messed up when I tried to bring the Aron the first time, so I'm completely changing it now the second time. I'm going to be less royal and more Eved Hashem, more servant of God. I'm going to carry the Aron in such a way that I feel is the right thing to do, as opposed to what people might think is the right thing to do. I'm going to go with my gut, with my heart, and carry the Aron properly. But you're right, Rob. Clothing is in Tanakh, it's a big problem. Absolutely, very good point.
It could also be a great benefit too, because we see when the priestly garments are being described in such great detail back in Exodus, with the apron, and there's the hat and the breeches. The 8 different garments that the high priest has to wear. It shows that when you wear the proper clothing in the right place at the right time, then you achieve a state of holiness.
Absolutely, and the Rav Hirsch has a wonderful piece on the significance of that, and very much so. All right, friends, this is it for today, and I look forward to seeing you next week.